Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a version of the Middle Ages that was far less dramatic than battlefields and castles, and in some ways much more unsettling. The ordinary experience of becoming ill in a world where a trained doctor was usually distant, expensive, or simply absent. For most people, sickness was not a rare emergency. It was a familiar shadow in the room, managed with memory, prayer, household remedies, and a great deal of uncertainty. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from and which history subject you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful, long-form history, a quiet like is always appreciated. And if you'd like more calm, carefully told journeys into the past, subscribing is a simple way to stay connected. Now, to understand what it was like to be sick without doctors in the Middle Ages, we have to begin by setting aside one modern assumption: that illness only becomes real once a professional has named it. For a medieval villager, illness was real long before it was explained. It arrived as heat in the forehead, a heaviness in the limbs, a stomach that would not settle, a cough that deepened at night, or a wound that looked wrong by morning. And what followed was not usually a visit to a clinic, because for most people there was no clinic in the modern sense, no reliable local physician on call, and no healthcare system waiting to receive them. There was only the household, the neighborhood, the parish, and whatever scraps of practical wisdom the community had gathered over generations. That is the first thing worth understanding, and it matters because it changes the emotional texture of the entire subject. The medieval world was not full of people passively waiting to die because they had no doctors. It was full of people doing the best they could within the limits of their time, using systems that made sense to them, even when those systems now seem painfully fragile. To be sick in the Middle Ages was not to enter a separate medical sphere. It was to remain in ordinary life while ordinary life struggled to absorb your weakness. Most illness began at home. That sounds obvious, but the detail matters. Home was not a private, hygienic refuge in the modern sense. A peasant cottage might be smoky, dark, cold in winter, damp in bad weather, crowded with bodies, and never entirely free from dirt, insects, stale air, or the presence of animals nearby. Even in wealthier households, comfort had limits. Fire soot settled into lungs. Water sources could be questionable. Bedding could hold fleas. Food storage was uncertain. If sickness came with fever, diarrhea, or infection, the environment itself could make recovery harder. And yet home was also where care happened. Not because it was ideal, but because it was the only realistic center of treatment for most people. A sick person was usually first attended by family members, especially women of the household, who carried an enormous practical burden in medieval healthcare without necessarily being called medical professionals. A mother, wife, sister, widow, or older neighbor might know which herbs soothed the stomach, which poultice drew heat from a swelling, which broth was gentle for weakness, which prayers were said for a lingering fever, and when an illness had crossed the invisible line from ordinary suffering into something truly alarming. This is another place where modern viewers often misunderstand the past. The absence of widespread doctors did not mean the absence of knowledge. It meant knowledge was distributed differently. Much of it lived in memory, custom, and repeated domestic practice. Some remedies were useful. Some were harmless comforts. Some were ineffective. A few were probably dangerous. But they were not random in the eyes of the people using them. They belonged to a world in which the body, the natural environment, religion, and inherited wisdom were all intertwined. If you were a poor laborer with a fever, no one around you would begin by discussing microbes, immune response, or dehydration. They would think in terms available to them. Perhaps your body had become imbalanced. Perhaps the season had affected you. Perhaps bad air, spoiled food, exhaustion, sin, divine testing, or simple misfortune had opened the door to illness. These explanations did not always compete with one another. Medieval thinking was often more layered than modern summaries suggest. A person could believe that a disease had natural causes and still see spiritual meaning within it. That mixture of practicality and faith shaped the experience of being sick at every stage. A sore throat might be treated with warm infusions, honey if one could get it, rest if one could afford it, and prayer almost automatically. A wound might be washed, bound, inspected, and entrusted to God in the same hour. A child with a frightening fever might be given herbal remedies, while a family member promised a pilgrimage or lit a candle to a saint associated with healing. To modern ears, this can sound like confusion. To medieval people, it was often simply completeness. You addressed the body and the soul because both mattered. The problem, of course, was that many illnesses were indifferent to sincerity. A minor infection could become life-threatening. A bout of diarrhea could empty strength from the body with terrifying speed. A rotten tooth could swell into agony and then into something worse. Childbirth could move from hope to crisis in a single night. Even a small cut, especially for someone already weakened by poor diet or hard labor, might turn dangerous. In a society without antibiotics, without antiseptic technique as we understand it, and without dependable emergency intervention, the line between inconvenience and catastrophe was much thinner than most people now imagine. That thin line created a constant, low-level anxiety in daily life. Not always spoken, not always dramatic, but present. You woke with a pain and watched it. You noticed whether it spread. You judged whether the sick person could still eat, still stand, still keep food down, still speak clearly. Communities became skilled at reading signs, though not in the language modern medicine would use. They watched color, appetite, sleep, sweating, the smell of wounds, the character of coughing, the confusion of fever. Observation mattered because often observation was all you had before deciding whether to spend scarce money seeking outside help. And outside help existed, but unevenly. Medieval medicine was not empty. Learned physicians did exist, especially in towns and cities, and especially for the wealthy. Universities trained some practitioners. Medical texts circulated. Ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates still shaped theory. But all of that was filtered through geography, class, literacy, and cost. For a great many people, a university-trained physician was not part of normal life. He belonged to another social layer, one that many villagers might never directly encounter. Even where such a practitioner could be found, there was no guarantee of a cure. That is important too. The modern fantasy of the absent doctor sometimes hides a deeper truth. Even when medieval medicine had a doctor, it often did not have a solution. A learned man might read urine, take the pulse, ask about diet, sleep, and stool, and place the illness within the framework of humors and imbalance. He might prescribe a regimen, recommend changes in food, suggest rest, order bloodletting, or prepare compounds from herbs, minerals, or animal products. Sometimes this may have helped. Sometimes the body recovered on its own while the treatment received the credit. Sometimes the treatment probably made little difference. So for ordinary people, the issue was not simply that doctors were missing. It was that certainty itself was missing. To be sick in the Middle Ages was often to live inside a question. Was this passing or fatal? Was it caused by something eaten, by cold, by corruption in the air, by divine displeasure, by overwork, by age, or by no reason anyone could ever fully know? Should the patient be warmed or cooled? Fed more or less, bled or left alone, moved near the fire or kept from it, given ale, broth, vinegar, herbs, garlic, onions, milk, or nothing at all for a while? Every choice mattered because each choice was made under pressure, with incomplete knowledge, by people who still had fields to tend, bread to bake, children to manage, and animals to keep alive. That practical burden is easy to miss when we imagine medieval sickness in purely symbolic terms. Illness was not only painful, it was disruptive. In a household living close to subsistence, one person's fever could unsettle the labor pattern of everyone else. If the man who plowed could not stand, if the woman who managed food preparation could not rise, if a child needed constant watching, the household economy immediately wobbled. There was no paid sick leave. There was barely even spare time. Recovery required care, but care cost labor, and labor was survival. This made the experience of being ill deeply social. Your body did not belong to you alone. Your weakness spread outward into the day of others. Someone had to fetch water. Someone had to sit beside you. Someone had to decide whether to save the expensive egg for the sickbed or for tomorrow's meal. Someone had to hear you moan through the night and still rise before dawn. Medieval tenderness existed, certainly, but so did exhaustion. Compassion could sit very close to fear, irritation, guilt, and quiet calculation. And sometimes the sick themselves understood this too well. One of the lonelier aspects of illness in any age is the feeling of becoming a burden, but in the medieval world that feeling had sharper edges. If recovery dragged on, if medicine cost money, if the patient could not work through harvest, the emotional weight could become almost as heavy as the physical one. Not because families were heartless, but because love did not cancel material limits. There is a tendency to imagine pre-modern sickness as a purely grim experience, but even here the truth is more textured. Alongside fear, there was familiarity. People lived much closer to cycles of weakness and recovery than many modern urban populations do. They expected illness to visit homes. They understood convalescence as part of life, not an exceptional interruption. A lingering cough, bad joints, recurring stomach trouble, winter fevers, infected skin, eye irritation, women's reproductive pain, and the slow wear of age were woven into the normal human landscape. This did not make suffering easier, but it did make it legible. People knew what prolonged discomfort looked like. They had seen it before in others. That gave them not control, but a vocabulary of endurance. And endurance, more than cure, may be the central theme here. The Middle Ages were full of treatments, but daily survival often depended on the quieter arts of waiting, watching, easing, and hoping. A patient might lie in bed or on a pallet, listening to the small sounds of the household continuing without them. The shifting of pots, the murmur of prayer, footsteps on beaten earth, the crackle of the hearth, a child being hushed, someone stepping outside into cold dawn. There is something almost unbearably human in that scene. Not dramatic, not famous, not even uniquely medieval. Just a person feeling their body become uncertain, and a family trying to decide what can still be done. As we move deeper into this world, we have to ask a more uncomfortable question. If most illness began in the household, and if doctors were distant or limited, then who exactly was trusted when sickness stopped feeling ordinary and started feeling dangerous? In practice, the answer was not one person, but a whole crowded landscape of healers, clergy, neighbors, folk knowledge, and learned medicine, each carrying a different kind of authority, and not always agreeing with one another. Each carried a different kind of authority, and not always agreeing with one another. A village might have no resident physician at all, but it was rarely empty of people who claimed some power to relieve suffering. There were women known for their skill with herbs, older men who had seen enough wounds to speak with confidence about them, midwives whose experience extended beyond childbirth into wider bodily knowledge, monks and nuns connected with infirmaries or charitable care, barber surgeons in towns, apothecaries where towns were large enough to support them, and priests who were not medical men in the strict sense, but who remained central whenever illness raised the possibility of death, sin, fear, or divine intervention. The modern instinct is often to separate these figures sharply, as though one represented medicine and the other superstition. Medieval people did not necessarily see the boundaries that way. Trust was practical before it was theoretical. You turned first to the person who had helped someone like you before, or who was said to have a steady hand, or who possessed a respected recipe, or who was known to be calm around blood, fever, childbirth, or pain. Reputation mattered as much as formal learning, and in some places much more. A healer did not need a framed credential to inspire confidence. It was enough that neighbors said she had reduced a swelling, or that he had set a limb well, or that prayers spoken over a sick child seemed once to have been followed by recovery. This did not mean all healers were equal. Medieval society could be deeply suspicious as well as deeply dependent. The same village that relied on local remedies might whisper uneasily if a healer seemed too secretive, too successful, or too linked with charms that sat awkwardly between devotion and magic. A remedy spoken over in Latin-like phrases could sound impressive to one listener and sinister to another. A woman valued for attending difficult births might also be viewed with uneasy respect, especially if outcomes were mixed, as they so often were. This ambiguity is one of the more revealing features of the period. People needed help badly enough to tolerate uncertain authority, but uncertainty itself produced anxiety. Trust was often provisional, earned case by case. If illness worsened, choices became heavier. A family might decide to send for someone from a nearby market town, and that decision was never trivial. Distance cost time. Time could be the very thing running out. Payment cost money or goods, and these might already be in short supply. Even arranging transport or a messenger meant labor lost elsewhere. The very act of seeking specialized help therefore carried an admission. This was not merely another passing sickness. It had crossed into danger. The moment of sending for help was, in its own quiet way, a threshold of dread. And yet, even then, the arrival of a practitioner did not bring the sort of reassurance modern people imagine. It brought another layer of interpretation. A learned physician, where one was available, might begin not with the site of pain but with the body as a whole. Medieval medicine, especially the learned tradition influenced by ancient and Arabic scholarship, was interested in balance, complexion, digestion, environment, sleep, emotions, and the movement of substances through the body. To a modern patient, this could seem indirect. Why discuss recent meals and bowel habits when the chest hurts or the skin burns? But within humoral medicine, such questions were not distractions. They were the path to understanding. The body, in that framework, was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant proportion and proper relation. Illness meant imbalance, obstruction, corruption, or excess. It was a theory that now sounds remote, but for centuries it offered a coherent way of organizing symptoms, temperaments, seasons, foods, and treatments into one large explanatory system. And what made it powerful was not merely that educated people believed it. Could also make intuitive sense in daily life. People observed that hot weather affected the body differently from cold weather, that some foods seemed heavy and some light, that anger, grief, sleep, and appetite changed how one felt. Humoral medicine turned these observations into a structured universe. So if you were ill, your complaint would often be read in relation to qualities such as hot, cold, wet, and dry. A fever was not just a fever. It suggested heat. Thick mucus suggested phlegmatic excess. Sluggish digestion, melancholy, irritability, flushing, dryness, heaviness, all of these could be fitted into a logic that shaped treatment. The remedy would ideally oppose the imbalance. Cooling where there was heat, moistening where there was dryness, lightening where there was heaviness, opening where there was blockage. The aim was not always to attack a disease as a modern drug might, but to guide the body back toward order. Some of this guidance came through regimen, and this is one of the less dramatic but more important realities of medieval care. Treatment was not always a dramatic potion or a knife. It might be advice about food, drink, rest, bathing, purging, exercise, air, and sexual restraint. Wealthier patients were more likely to receive detailed regimens because they had the means to follow them. They could obtain certain foods, avoid certain tasks, rest in better quarters, and pay for compounds prepared with care. Poorer patients, by contrast, often had to recover in conditions that actively fought recovery. It is hard to overstate how much class shaped medicine, not only in access to practitioners but in access to the very conditions under which medical advice might work. A physician might tell a nobleman to avoid rich meats, sleep moderately, take gentle walks, and drink diluted wine in measured quantity. He might advise the household to regulate chamber temperature, alter bedding, prepare soft foods, and keep the patient from agitation. Such care was not guaranteed to save him, but it at least assumed a world in which instructions could be obeyed. A field laborer with a fever had no such luxury. Rest might mean the field went unattended. Special foods might not exist. A warm, dry chamber might be impossible. Clean linen might be limited. Even the act of drinking enough liquid could depend on who was free to fetch it and what vessels were available. This is where the comforting image of natural remedies begins to lose some of its romance. Medieval healing did indeed rely heavily on plants, oils, fats, waxes, vinegars, wines, honey, and other materials from the natural world. There were salves, syrups, decoctions, electuaries, plasters, gargles, and compresses. Many ingredients had long traditions behind them. Some herbs truly do contain compounds with useful effects. Honey, for instance, can be helpful in wound care and cough remedies under certain conditions. Willow has associations with pain relief. Garlic has antimicrobial properties. But medieval treatment was never just about discovering the right plant. It was about preparation, dosage, preservation, contamination, access, and interpretation. A potentially useful herb could be spoiled by poor storage, mixed with ineffective additions, or given in a context where the real danger was something no herb could overcome. And then there was bloodletting, perhaps the most famous and often most misunderstood of medieval interventions. Modern audiences tend to treat it as proof of total medical absurdity, a kind of historical punchline. But bloodletting made sense within the medical logic of the time. If illness involved excess pressure, overheating, or corrupt humors, then controlled removal of blood could appear rational. Practitioners did not think they were weakening the patient for no reason. They believed they were relieving dangerous imbalance. Bloodletting was also not performed in exactly the same way for every condition. Timing, quantity, location, season, patient age, and symptoms all mattered in theory. That said, theory did not guarantee wisdom in practice. For a weakened patient, blood loss could certainly worsen matters. Some must have died sooner because of it. Others may have undergone modest bleeding and recovered because their illness was never fatal to begin with. The difficulty, as always in pre-modern medicine, was that recovery and treatment were often entangled in ways impossible for contemporaries to sort out. If the patient improved, the treatment seemed justified. If the patient worsened, perhaps the treatment had come too late, or the disease had already been too strong, or the body too corrupted, or gods will lay elsewhere. In such a system, bad treatments could survive for centuries not because people were foolish, but because evidence was hard to isolate inside the chaos of real suffering. Surgery, meanwhile, occupied its own uneasy space. For many internal illnesses, there was little surgery could do. But for injuries, abscesses, certain skin conditions, dental problems, cataracts in limited contexts, bladder stones in specialized hands, and wounds of war or accident, surgical intervention existed and could be brutal. Without anesthesia in the modern sense, with infection always waiting, and with pain itself a major ordeal, surgery was both feared and necessary. A barber surgeon might lance, cut, cauterize, extract, bandage, or stitch, using techniques that could be skillful by the standards of the day and terrifying by any standard. Here again, outcomes varied wildly with experience, cleanliness, luck, and the patient's general condition. It is worth pausing over pain because pain in the medieval world was not merely a symptom. It was an atmosphere. Many people lived closer to untreated pain than most viewers in developed modern settings can easily imagine. Toothache alone could become a serious misery, recurring and relentless. Joint pain, infected skin, ulcers, eye inflammations, broken bones badly healed, childbirth injuries, hernias, kidney stones, and chronic digestive distress might accompany a person for years. In the absence of reliable analgesics, relief was partial, inconsistent, and precious. Alcohol could dull some suffering. Certain herbs and preparations could sedate or numb to a degree. But for many, endurance was not an abstract virtue. It was the daily method by which life continued. This helps explain why religion was not simply layered onto sickness from the outside. It entered through pain itself. If suffering could not be quickly removed, it had to be interpreted. Prayer, confession, penance, relics, saints, pilgrimages, blessings, and the sacraments all offered not only hope of miraculous cure, but meaning in the face of fear. A sick person might be encouraged to set worldly matters in order, reconcile disputes, confess sins, and prepare spiritually without this necessarily meaning everyone had given up on bodily recovery. Medieval people could hope for healing and prepare for death at the same time. Indeed, they often felt it was prudent to do both. The parish priest, therefore, had a role that was medically indirect but emotionally central. He might hear confession, offer communion, pray over the sick, and help frame the illness within a Christian moral universe. In severe cases, the rites associated with dying could be a source of grave comfort, not because death was easy, but because death without preparation was feared. The difference matters. Modern medicine often treats death as a failure of treatment. Medieval Christianity treated death as inevitable but spiritually consequential. That did not make grief lighter, but it changed the logic of the sickroom. And the sickroom itself could become a crowded place of conflicting hopes. Family members might want stronger remedies, more prayers, different foods, less bloodletting, more bloodletting, a saint's intervention, a local healer's poultice, a physician's regimen, warmth, coolness, quiet, watchfulness. The patient, if conscious, might have preferences of his or her own. Medieval illness was not experienced in silence and perfect order. It was discussed, negotiated, worried over, and interpreted by multiple people at once. Advice could be contradictory. Tempers could fray. Fear could sharpen conviction. One person swore by vinegar. Another distrusted it. One wanted the window opened for air. Another feared cold. One thought the illness sent by God. Another blamed spoiled meat. None of them had laboratory confirmation waiting just beyond the door. Sometimes, of course, the body recovered despite all this confusion. A fever broke in the night. A swelling drained. A wound stopped smelling foul. Appetite returned. A child sat up and asked for food. The relief must have felt immense, not only because life had been preserved, but because uncertainty had finally loosened its grip. Recovery in such circumstances could seem almost miraculous even when no miracle had occurred. Families remembered what had been tried, which in turn reinforced community knowledge. A herb tea given before improvement might gain new prestige. A saint's shrine visited during recovery might gain fresh devotion. The lesson people drew from recovery was not always the lesson modern medicine would draw. And when recovery did not come, the descent could be painfully gradual. There were many illnesses for which no dramatic turning point existed. Only thinning, weakness, coughing, wasting, confusion, or the slow failure of appetite. Tuberculosis, though not understood in modern terms, was part of this world. So were chronic fevers, intestinal diseases, parasitic burdens, recurring respiratory illness, and conditions no one could clearly classify. In those cases, being sick without effective doctors was not one sharp event but a long diminishment, stretching across weeks or months, draining the household alongside the body. For the poor, that long diminishment could lead into another medieval institution that reveals much about the period: charity. Monasteries, hospitals in the older sense, almshouses, and religious houses sometimes cared for the sick, poor, elderly, or travelers. But these places were not hospitals in the modern curative sense. They were often more about hospitality, relief, spiritual care, and shelter than specialized treatment. Even so, they mattered. They represented one of the few organized responses to vulnerability beyond the family. To enter such a place, however, was not simply to receive medicine. It could mean crossing into a space where care, discipline, prayer, and poverty met under religious authority. And that raises the next question naturally, because once sickness moved beyond the private household and into these broader structures of charity, devotion, and communal obligation, the experience changed again. Illness was no longer just a domestic problem. It became something visible, managed, and judged in public settings, where mercy, status, and fear of contagion all began to shape what happened next. The moment illness left the home and entered a charitable house, an infirmary, or one of the institutions we loosely call a medieval hospital, it stepped into a different moral landscape. These places were founded less to conquer disease than to respond to human frailty in a Christian society. They offered beds, food, prayer, supervision, and in some cases some degree of treatment, but they were not neutral medical spaces in the modern sense. They were religious and social institutions, and that meant the sick person was no longer simply a patient. He or she was also a soul to be cared for, a body to be managed, and sometimes a burden to be categorized. The word hospital itself can mislead here. In much of the medieval world, hospitals might shelter the elderly poor, pilgrims, foundlings, the disabled, and the infirm all under one roof or within the same charitable mission. Some specialized more than others. Some were cleaner, richer, and more disciplined than others. A few urban institutions connected with major religious houses or wealthy endowments could provide something approaching sustained organized care. But for many people, entering such a place did not mean access to advanced medicine. It meant access to attention, routine, and relief from complete abandonment. That relief mattered more than it may first seem. In a household under strain, prolonged illness could become nearly impossible to manage. A person who needed turning, washing, feeding, comforting, and watching through the night demanded time that a poor family might simply not possess. To move that person into a charitable setting, where beds were tended and prayers were regular, could be an act not of rejection but of desperate practicality. Yet it could also feel like a surrender. The sick were crossing from the intimate world of kinship into a rule-bound environment shaped by strangers, bells, schedules, and collective discipline. Inside, the day was likely calmer in some ways and harsher in others. There might be more regular food than at home, though not necessarily food suited to the patient's exact needs. There might be cleaner bedding, though cleanliness itself varied enormously. There would almost certainly be prayer. Spiritual care was not an optional extra. It was central. The institution justified itself partly through charity and partly through the care of souls. The sick poor were not only recipients of mercy. They also gave benefactors an opportunity to perform Christian duty. That is another small but important reversal. To be ill and poor in the Middle Ages was not merely to receive charity. It was to become part of a moral economy in which others hoped, through aiding you, to secure grace for themselves. This did not make the care insincere. Medieval charity could be deeply genuine, but it did mean that compassion, discipline, status, and salvation were entwined in ways unfamiliar to modern secular medicine. A benefactor endowed beds partly because suffering moved him, partly because public piety mattered, partly because remembrance and prayer mattered, and partly because the social order expected visible acts of mercy. The institution that sheltered the sick therefore reflected not only kindness but hierarchy. Some people entered it as humble recipients. Others funded it, governed it, and expected spiritual return. If you were lying ill in such a place, your experience depended heavily on who you were and what exactly afflicted you. A respectable townsman fallen temporarily weak might be treated differently from a wandering beggar or a person marked by chronic disability. Social rank never vanished simply because the body had become vulnerable. Medieval society was too attentive to status for that. Even within sickness, dignity could be unequally distributed. The well-born had private chambers when possible, better linen, better food, and greater access to learned care. The poor might lie in common wards, visible to one another, their suffering shared and impossible to hide. There is something strangely intimate and impersonal about that kind of space. On one hand, the sick were not isolated in the modern way. They heard other people groan, pray, cough, mutter, and die. Illness was communal, audible, and impossible to fully privatize. On the other hand, the very crowding of suffering could flatten the individual story. In a room where many were weak, each pain had to compete for limited attention. A carer might be kind and exhausted at once. Beds might be tended with devotion, and yet not with the one-to-one constancy a family member could give. For some patients, that was still better than home. For others, it may have felt lonely in a different register. And looming over these institutions, and over medieval attitudes to sickness more generally, was the problem of contagion, even before contagion was understood in modern biological terms. Medieval people did not have germ theory, but they were not blind to patterns. They could see that certain illnesses moved through households, streets, monasteries, and towns with alarming speed. They noticed that proximity sometimes preceded disease. They observed seasons of sickness, foul smells, corrupted water, marshy air, and the clustering of death. Their explanations varied. Some blamed miasma, some divine punishment, some astral influences, some corrupted matter in the environment, and some a combination of these. But whatever the theory, fear had practical consequences. When an illness seemed likely to spread, generosity could collide with self-protection. A family might care tenderly for a feverish relative, but step a little farther back than usual. A town might endow places for the sick, but also begin to separate certain bodies from ordinary life. A monastery dedicated to mercy might still impose rules on who could enter, where they could sleep, what they could touch, and whether they belonged among the general sick or in a separate category altogether. This is where medieval medicine begins to shade into medieval social control. Care was never only about relieving pain. It was also about preserving order. Leprosy, or rather the wide range of conditions medieval people grouped under that name, offers a revealing example. Modern viewers often think immediately of dramatic biblical imagery or of wholesale exclusion, but the reality was more uneven. Some people diagnosed or suspected as leprous were not simply cast into wilderness. There were leper houses, charitable communities, legal protections in some contexts, and ritual structures that marked both exclusion and continued belonging to the Christian community. Yet none of that removed the loneliness of being categorized as dangerous, unclean, or permanently set apart. What matters here is not only the disease itself but the social logic around it. Certain conditions frightened medieval people not merely because they killed, but because they disfigured, persisted, and seemed to threaten the visible boundaries of the community. A person whose body changed in unsettling ways could become an object of pity, fear, revulsion, and religious interpretation all at once. Here sickness was no longer private weakness. It became a public sign. And once the body became a sign, other people felt entitled to interpret it. That is a broader truth of medieval illness. The body was read. It was read for symptoms, but also for moral meaning, social risk, and spiritual significance. A wasting disease might provoke compassion, but it might also raise whispered questions about sin, divine judgment, hidden vice, or bad living. Not everyone thought in these terms all the time, and it would be unfair to suggest a universally harsh society constantly moralized every sickness. But the possibility was always there, because medieval Christianity and medieval medicine both encouraged people to treat the body as meaningful. A body in distress could seem to reveal more than pain. This could be especially hard for those with chronic conditions that altered appearance. Skin diseases, ulcerations, facial swellings, blindness, lameness, and visible deformity were not only physical hardships. They shaped how others responded. Medieval communities could be generous, yet they were also intensely visual. To look wrong was to attract notice, to smell of illness, to move with difficulty, to cough blood, to carry rotting wounds. All of this changed one's position in everyday life. The sick person became not only someone who suffered, but someone who disturbed the ordinary flow of social comfort. And still, medieval society did not have the luxury of simply ignoring such people. Communities were too interdependent for that. The poor sick still begged, prayed, worked when they could, sought alms, traveled, entered churches, and appeared at gates. Towns therefore had to decide, over and over again, how much visibility of suffering they could tolerate and under what conditions. The answer varied by place, wealth, season, and fear. In ordinary times, charity might flow more easily. In times of epidemic or scarcity, patience narrowed. This becomes even clearer when we move from long illness to sudden waves of mass sickness. Before the Black Death, Europe had already known epidemic disease, famine-related illness, and periodic mortality shocks. Communities had experience with sickness arriving not as an isolated misfortune but as a broader season of dread. Crops failed, hunger weakened bodies, and then disease found easier prey. Flooding, cold summers, bad harvests, and war all made populations more vulnerable. What looked like disease in isolation was often disease entering a body already shaped by malnutrition, exhaustion, and stress. That is another place where modern viewers can misjudge the medieval world. People did not encounter sickness against a neutral background. They encountered it while living close to the edge. Consider winter in a poor household. Food stores thinning. Salted provisions growing monotonous. Fresh vegetables scarce. Smoke thick inside. Clothing worn. Animals needing care. Children already run down. The body enters spring not refreshed but depleted. In such conditions, a respiratory illness or intestinal infection is not merely an inconvenience. It lands on a population whose reserves are low. This is why medieval sickness was so often a story about conditions rather than single causes. Disease did not act alone. It cooperated with poverty, weather, crowding, bad harvests, parasites, and labor. Even urban prosperity created its own traps. Towns and cities offered access to markets, some specialized practitioners, and charitable institutions, but they also concentrated waste, crowding, and vulnerability. Streets could be filthy. Water could be contaminated. Animals, refuse, tanners' runoff, slaughter waste, and human excrement existed far closer together than modern city dwellers would tolerate. Authorities did care, at least intermittently, about sanitation. Ordinances were issued. Nuisances were fined. Certain trades were pushed to particular zones. But medieval towns were living organisms, not tidy plans, and their physical density created a constant background risk. To be sick in such an environment meant the air itself could feel suspect. Smell mattered enormously in medieval thinking. Foul odors were not just unpleasant. They were often understood as signs of corruption and possible danger. A sick room with bad smells, an alley with rot, a marshy edge of town, a stagnant ditch, all of these were read as medically significant. This sounds unscientific only if we ignore that smell often does accompany decay, waste, and contamination. The theory may have been incomplete, but the sensory warning system was not irrational. Medieval people were using the evidence available to them. Their responses could therefore mix sensible environmental concern with ineffective theory. They might burn pleasant substances, open or close windows depending on assumptions about air, move away from stench, avoid certain waters, or flee towns when mortality rose. The wealthy were often best positioned to do this. They could leave crowded urban centers and retreat to country estates. The poor could not. Illness, once again, revealed hierarchy with painful clarity. Some bodies could escape unhealthy places. Others had to remain inside them. That same inequality shaped the experience of treatment during epidemics. When sickness became widespread, personal attention diminished even further. Healers themselves fell ill. Priests died. Carers were overwhelmed. Burial systems strained. People who might have received care in quieter times found themselves one among many. The emotional experience of being sick in such moments must have been profoundly different from ordinary household illness. Not only were you weak, you were surrounded by evidence that weakness was everywhere. The soundscape changed. More bells, more processions, more prayers, more silence in houses where someone had already died. Yet even before the Great Plague years intensified these patterns, medieval people had developed habits of response that mixed resignation with action. They prayed, cleaned as they understood cleaning, sought better air, changed diet where possible, made vows, called for sacraments, avoided some places, entered others, and looked anxiously at neighbors' faces for signs of the same trouble. In these moments, the absence of modern doctors was felt not only as a lack of cure, but as a lack of reliable explanation. Rumor spread where knowledge ended, and rumor, in frightened communities, could become almost a second disease. One story might say the sickness began with spoiled grain, another with poisoned wells, another with a conjunction of planets, another with divine wrath provoked by human vice, another with strangers, another with the dead not properly buried. Each theory offered something the body desperately wanted when it is afraid. Cause means pattern. Pattern means perhaps some control. Without it, sickness is just chaos. Medieval communities, like all human communities, hated chaos. So they explained, even when explanation ran ahead of evidence. That need to explain also shaped who was blamed, who was trusted, and who was cast as necessary. Certain healers gained sudden prestige during crises. Others fell under suspicion. Religious houses might be praised for charity one year and feared as crowded centers of infection the next. Town governments might issue practical orders and at the same time sponsor penitential acts. Learned medicine might coexist with popular remedies, not because one had defeated the other, but because in moments of collective fear people reached for every framework they possessed. And at the center of all this remained the ordinary sick individual, who still had to drink, breathe, sleep, sweat, and wait through the night. However large the social patterns became, sickness continued to be lived minute by minute. The mouth dry with fever, the blanket too heavy then too light, the pounding in the temples, the strange dreams, the taste of bitterness from a remedy, the dread of footsteps if they might bring bad news, and the dread of silence if no one came at all. History can speak in systems, but illness is always experienced in the body first. That is why the next step in this story matters so much. If we want to understand what it truly meant to be sick without dependable doctors in the Middle Ages, we have to move from institutions and theories into the intimate details of symptoms themselves. Fever, wounds, childbirth, hunger, tooth pain, bowel illness, and the slow damage of everyday infection. Because once we enter that more physical world, the medieval body stops seeming abstract, and the practical brutality of ordinary sickness comes into much sharper view. Because once we enter that more physical world, the medieval body stops seeming abstract, and the practical brutality of ordinary sickness comes into much sharper view. Fever, for instance, was one of the most familiar and most unnerving forms of illness a medieval person could know. It was common enough to be recognized immediately, yet vague enough to conceal almost anything beneath it. A fever could mean influenza-like infection, contaminated food, a festering wound, malaria in some regions, postpartum infection, childhood disease, or the first visible rise of something far worse. That uncertainty made fever frightening in a particular way. It began with signs everyone knew: flushed skin, shivering, aching limbs, thirst, confusion, sweat, restlessness, but offered very little certainty about where it would end. In a world without thermometers, people still understood degrees of heat. They felt it through touch, through the sight of brightened cheeks and heavy eyes, through the patient's strange relation to blankets and fire. Someone burning with fever might still tremble with cold. A family member would place a hand to the forehead, neck, or chest and judge not with numbers, but with memory. Does this feel like the fever he had last winter? Is she hotter than yesterday? Is the sweating a good sign or a bad one? These were subtle acts of observation, repeated countless times in homes where no formal diagnosis would ever come. The treatment of fever followed the broad medical logic of balance, but it also followed common sense as people understood common sense. The patient might be kept in bed, watched for changes, given diluted ale, water, broth, pottage, or herbal infusions if these could be tolerated. Some remedies aimed to cool, others to strengthen, others to open the body and expel what was thought to be corrupt matter. Bedding might be adjusted. The fire tended more carefully. The room watched for drafts or foul air. If the fever climbed, prayers became more urgent, not because all practical action ceased, but because practical action was never felt to be enough on its own. What made fever especially difficult was the way it altered the mind. A high fever could produce muttering, disorientation, agitation, and dreamlike speech. To the household, this could be deeply unsettling. The sick person was present and absent at the same time. A man who had worked all week in the fields might suddenly speak nonsense in the night. A child might stare without recognizing a parent. A woman weakened after childbirth might drift in and out of awareness. In those moments, illness did not feel like pain alone. It felt like personality slipping. And because medieval people lived in a world alive with spiritual meanings, confusion could be read in several ways at once. As heat in the body, weakness in the brain, divine trial, or the first shadow of death. Not all fevers killed, of course. Many broke, and when they did, the moment was probably one of the most relieving in medieval domestic life. The patient drank without retching. The sweating changed character. Sleep finally came. The eyes seemed clearer. Appetite returned slightly, then more. Recovery might still be slow, but the household could feel the body turning back toward life. Yet even a past fever left a mark. Strength returned unevenly. Weight might be lost. Work resumed too early. A person could seem recovered and still be vulnerable. This incomplete recovery was likely one reason recurrent sickness felt so ordinary in the period. People did not always return to health in a clean modern arc. They staggered back into labor with bodies only partly restored. Before morning. That phrase carried a particular weight in the medieval world, because night changed the experience of illness in ways both practical and emotional. In daylight, there were tasks to perform, messengers to send, neighbors to consult, herbs to gather, prayers to say in company, and the simple distraction of movement. At night, the household narrowed around the sickbed. Firelight flattened faces into shadow. Sounds became sharper. Breathing was listened to with unusual care. A cough in darkness could feel more serious than the same cough at noon. Fever often seemed to intensify after sunset, not only because bodies do change across the day, but because the night stripped away the illusion that there would always be more time to decide what to do. This is where illness became a test not only of remedies but of judgment. Families had to read thresholds. Is the patient merely exhausted or slipping? Is this sweat a sign of breaking fever or of collapse? Is that sleep or a deeper stillness? Should someone leave at once to fetch the priest, even if the road is dark and the journey difficult? Should the healer be called again, or has everything already been tried? Medieval life required people to make such decisions without instruments, without emergency services, and often without much agreement among those present. The pressure of choosing must have been enormous, particularly because regret was built into every possible outcome. Call too soon and precious effort or money had been spent. Call too late and the soul or body might be lost unprepared. The approach of death, when it became visible, altered the room. Care no longer meant only feeding, cooling, binding, or watching. It became moral care as well. One of the most striking differences between medieval and modern sickness lies here. In a modern hospital, when death approaches, the language is often clinical, administrative, and emotional. In the Middle Ages, it was also sacramental. If a person seemed likely to die, the question was not simply whether anything more could be done medically, but whether the person would die in a state properly prepared for judgment. Confession, absolution, the Eucharist where possible, the anointing of the sick, prayers, and the settling of debts or disputes could all become urgent. That urgency did not mean the household had given up on recovery. Medieval people did not think in such neat stages. A priest might be summoned while remedies were still being given. A patient might confess and then recover. Spiritual readiness was not necessarily the sign of immediate surrender. It was the sign of prudence in a world where the turn from sickness to death could be swift. What mattered was that bodily and spiritual care ran alongside each other until the end. A person could be cooled with cloths, urged to sip broth, and instructed to make peace with God all within the same hour. This must have made the emotional atmosphere of serious illness very different from what many people now imagine. There was fear, certainly, and grief held just beneath the surface. But there was also form. Ritual offered a structure into which terror could be poured. When the future could no longer be controlled, at least it could be prepared for. Words existed. Gestures existed. The priest knew what to say. The family knew where to kneel, when to answer, when to weep quietly, when to hold back so the dying could speak. This did not soften the pain of losing someone, but it did mean that death, when it came, entered a recognized pathway rather than absolute improvisation. And yet, even in these solemn hours, practical concerns never disappeared. Who would inherit the tools, the plot, the animal, the debt, the obligations? Who would care for the widow, the children, the aging parent? Medieval households were economic units as much as emotional ones, and the dying often knew this very well. A last conversation might concern not only forgiveness and the soul but who owed grain, who should be trusted, where a small store of coins was hidden, whether the daughter's marriage arrangement should still go forward, whether a son was ready to assume work he had not expected so soon. Illness therefore revealed one of the deepest truths about medieval life. The body was tied by 100 threads to household survival, and when that body began to fail, the whole net trembled. Of course, not all dangerous turns ended in death. Some of the most intense medieval sickroom experiences likely came from patients who seemed close to the edge and then, slowly, unexpectedly, returned. A deep fever might break. A bleeding might stop. A swollen wound might drain enough to buy time. A woman after childbirth might survive the night that everyone feared she would not see through. Such recoveries could become family legends, retold for years with the memory of the candlelight, the prayers, the exact words spoken, the moment the patient opened their eyes more clearly and asked for food or water. In a world without precise medical explanation, recoveries at the brink acquired a powerful texture. They felt meaningful, and that meaning could attach itself to the remedy, the saint, the timing of confession, the skill of the midwife, or simply to God's mercy. This, in turn, shaped memory and belief. Medieval medical culture was not only built from texts and theories. It was built from remembered outcomes. People trusted what seemed to have worked before. A certain herb was praised because Uncle so-and-so improved after taking it. A shrine gained fame because several fevers had lifted after vows were made there. A healer's reputation spread because neighbors could name recoveries. The difficulty, from a modern perspective, is that human beings are not good at separating correlation from cause when fear and relief are involved. Medieval people were no exception. Yet this did not make them uniquely gullible. It made them human. Even now, people cling to whatever seemed to help during crisis. And sometimes what helped most was not a remedy at all, but timing. Many infections resolve or worsen according to forces invisible to the sufferer. The medieval household experienced only the surface of that struggle. They saw heat, swelling, discharge, delirium, appetite, sleep, and strength. When a patient turned the corner, they did not see immune systems, bacterial load, viral course, or inflammatory response. They saw a blessed change. That gap between what they could observe and what was actually happening inside the body shaped every medical judgment they made. This becomes especially clear with bleeding and bodily discharge, both of which played a larger role in medieval reasoning than many modern people find comfortable. Blood, pus, vomit, diarrhea, mucus, sweat, urine, menstrual flow, breast milk, and semen were all treated as meaningful substances. They were not merely waste products or symptoms. They were clues to the state of the body. If matter left the body, one had to ask whether it was necessary, dangerous, relieving, excessive, corrupt, or providential. Pus draining from a wound might be welcomed if it signaled release, feared if it smelled too foul, or tolerated because at least the body was expelling something visible. Vomiting could be distressing, yet perhaps useful if the stomach was thought overloaded. Diarrhea weakened the body, but purging was also sometimes used deliberately. The line between symptom and treatment could therefore become surprisingly unstable. Urine in particular carried diagnostic importance. Learned physicians famously inspected its color, cloudiness, sediment, smell, and sometimes taste, though popular imagination has exaggerated the elegance of this process. Still, urine was one of the few routinely available windows into the hidden interior of the body. A flask of urine could even be carried to a practitioner in the patient's absence, though this naturally risked error. The very fact that so much interpretive weight could rest on urine tells us something profound about medieval medicine. It was a medicine of surfaces, not superficial in the careless sense, but dependent on whatever outward signs the inward body allowed. That reliance on visible signs had consequences for who received attention soonest. A person visibly bleeding, burning with fever, unable to keep food down, or swollen in obvious ways made a clear claim on others. Someone declining more quietly might not. Chronic anemia, slow cancers, heart failure, internal infections, subtle neurological damage, and many other conditions would have been much harder to name or prioritize. The medieval sickroom was full of acute sensory evidence, and naturally it responded most urgently to what could be seen, smelled, heard, or touched. This may be one reason some chronic sufferers must have lived so long in a gray zone between recognized illness and accepted misery. There was also the question of age. Children and the elderly occupied particularly fragile positions, though for different reasons. Children were vulnerable because their bodies could be overwhelmed quickly. The elderly often carried the cumulative damage of a lifetime and recovered slowly, if at all. Yet old age itself complicated diagnosis. Was this illness or simply decline? When an old person lost appetite, strength, or sleep, the household might not know where ordinary aging ended and dangerous sickness began. Medieval people were familiar with aging bodies, but familiarity does not remove uncertainty. It may only make it quieter. Older people who survived repeated illnesses may also have occupied a special place in household memory. They were living archives of what had been tried before, who had died of what, which herbs were considered trustworthy, which seasons were dangerous, which springs brought ague, which births turned difficult. This is one reason it is too simple to tell the story of medieval sickness as a story of ignorance gradually illuminated only by formal doctors. Households themselves carried dense medical memory. Grandmothers, widows, older laborers, monastic infirmarians, midwives, and experienced neighbors had seen enough to notice patterns, even if they explained those patterns differently from modern science. At times, their observations were impressively practical. They knew that dirty or stagnant places seemed unhealthy. They knew that some waters upset the body. They knew that hunger invited sickness. They knew that exhaustion made people fail faster. They knew that some seasons brought recurring fevers. They knew that wounds needed watching, that foul smells mattered, that rest mattered, that childbirth required skill, that a patient who stopped drinking was in grave danger, and that certain symptoms meant one should summon help sooner rather than later. Medieval medicine was not powerless because medieval people were unobservant. It was limited because observation alone can only carry you so far without the deeper structures of modern anatomy, microbiology, pharmacology, and public health. Still, one should be careful not to make the contrast too neat. Modern medicine has made certain medieval terrors vanish or shrink dramatically, but one part of the old experience remains surprisingly recognizable: the social experience of waiting. To be ill without certainty is still one of the most difficult human states. The medieval patient knew it intensely, waiting to see whether the fever rises again, waiting to see whether the child will wake, waiting to hear whether the messenger found the priest, waiting to see if the cough loosens or deepens, waiting through the long dark interval after a dose has been given, when no one knows whether the body is turning toward recovery or away from it. That patience was not serene. It was a form of suspended fear. The night vigil around the sickbed, therefore, became one of the central theaters of medieval life. Someone fed the fire. Someone dozed upright. Someone murmured prayers under their breath. Someone stepped outside and looked at the darkness, hoping absurdly that the cold air might somehow bring clarity. Inside, the patient shifted, moaned, coughed, or lay too still. The hours moved differently in such rooms. History, which often loves big dates and public events, misses these private durations. Yet, for most medieval people, the deepest experience of sickness was probably not the famous epidemic or the learned physician's visit. It was the fourth hour of a cold night, beside someone they loved, listening for the next breath. And when the breath changed, people knew it. There is an intimate literacy in households that have lived close to illness. Breathing grows shallow, then irregular. The chest labors. The pauses lengthen. The face alters. These signs were not medical secrets. They belonged to human attention. Medieval people recognized them just as people do now. The difference lay in what could be done once they appeared. A modern clinician may reach for oxygen, suction, antibiotics, surgery, pain relief, fluids, monitors. A medieval household reached for touch, prayer, ritual, perhaps one last attempt at a remedy, and often an inward reckoning with helplessness. Helplessness, though, did not always produce passivity. Sometimes it produced motion, desperate motion, sudden vows, relics fetched in haste, blessed water, calls for more lights, more prayers, more attempts to rouse the failing person, more insistence that they swallow something, say something, confess something, signal that they still understood. There is something universal in that refusal to stop acting while action is still imaginable. Medieval people were no less vulnerable to it than anyone else. The sick room at the edge of death could become almost feverish in its own way, not because the patient was moving, but because everyone around them was trying to resist the narrowing of possibilities. This emotional pressure must have been particularly acute in illnesses that struck quickly, where there was no slow period of adjustment. A child choking with throat swelling, a sudden violent flux, a woman hemorrhaging after labor, a man injured by a fall or tool, a previously active person reduced in a single day to delirium. Acute illness denied the household the comfort of gradual preparation. It forced recognition. One morning ordinary, one night unthinkable. In those cases, the lack of dependable doctors was felt most sharply because time itself became the enemy. The messenger might not return in time. The healer might arrive after the turning point. The priest might come for the dead rather than the dying. And yet, strikingly, medieval culture still found ways to fold even this brutality into social meaning. Bells rang. Neighbors came. Bodies were washed and watched. Prayers were said. The dead were not supposed to vanish anonymously. Even where medicine failed, community was expected to respond. That expectation did not guarantee tenderness, but it did mean illness and death were less hidden than they often are now. Children saw the sick. Neighbors heard of them. The dying remained in ordinary space. This constant visibility may be one reason medieval people spoke of mortality with a frankness that now feels almost severe. Death was not a distant institutional event. It was a household event, a street event, a parish event. The same visibility shaped the experience of recovery too. When someone survived, the neighborhood knew. There might be thanks offered publicly, candles lit, alms promised, stories repeated, and reputations adjusted. A healer who succeeded gained standing. A family whose prayers seemed answered gained renewed devotion. A priest associated with a good death or surprising recovery became memorable. In other words, sickness produced social memory in both directions. It taught people whom to trust and what to fear. It mapped the village or town in moral and practical terms. Which house had herbs? Which widow knew fever care? Which priest came quickly? Which surgeon's knife was steadier than the rest? Which saint was said to listen? All of this means that being sick without dependable doctors did not leave people in a social vacuum. It left them in a densely peopled world of unequal knowledge, uncertain remedies, and shared emotional labor. The medieval patient was rarely alone in the modern existential sense. But neither were they secure. They were held by a web that could comfort, interpret, confuse, discipline, and fail them all at once. Perhaps that is the deepest contradiction of the subject. The world around the sick was full of people, yet the decisive struggle still unfolded in lonely flesh. And once we see that contradiction clearly, another one comes into view. The Middle Ages are often imagined as a time of filth and fatalism, but people were in fact constantly trying to manage risk in the only ways available to them. Through diet, regimen, cleanliness as they understood it, movement, prayer, seasonal caution, and household habit. Some of those efforts were wiser than they first appear. Some were misdirected. But together they formed a kind of preventive medicine long before modern prevention existed by name. To understand that everyday management of health, we have to move out of the crisis sick room for a while and into the routines by which medieval people tried, however imperfectly, not to become dangerously ill in the first place. Not to become dangerously ill in the first place. That effort began not in the moment of crisis, but in the daily choreography of food, air, movement, sleep, bathing, and restraint. Medieval people did not possess preventive medicine in the modern scientific sense, but they were far from indifferent to the maintenance of health. In fact, one of the quieter surprises of the period is how much thought, especially in literate and urban circles, went into preserving balance before illness took hold. A great deal of medieval medicine was not about heroic intervention after the body failed. It was about trying to keep the body from slipping too far out of order. This was where learned medicine often sounded least alien. Physicians and medical writers placed great emphasis on what later tradition would call the non-naturals. Air, food and drink, sleep and waking, motion and rest, evacuation and retention, and the passions or emotions. The phrase itself is technical, but the underlying idea is remarkably human. Health could be supported or undermined by the conditions of ordinary life. Too much food, too little sleep, stagnant air, improper exercise, excessive sex, unresolved anger, long grief, constipation, drunkenness, and laziness could all disturb the body. So could exhaustion, exposure, poor nourishment, fear, and overwork. In other words, medieval medicine often understood that daily habit mattered, even if it explained the consequences through humors rather than hormones, pathogens, or metabolism. For the wealthy, this generated a whole literature of regimen. Advice books instructed nobles, clerics, urban elites, and prosperous households on how to live in ways thought conducive to health. What should be eaten in winter as opposed to summer? Which meats were lighter or heavier? How diluted wine ought to be? When to sleep? How long to walk after meals? Whether to bathe before or after eating? Which emotions overheated the body? How sexual moderation conserved strength? How certain occupations damaged particular constitutions? To modern ears this may sound fussy, but it reveals something important. The absence of reliable cures made prevention psychologically and socially valuable. If one could not count on rescue after sickness arrived, then discipline beforehand became more meaningful. Of course, there was a great gap between writing regimen and living it. A lord with multiple courses at table, heated chambers, servants, and leisure could worry about dietary balance in a way a peasant could not. If a text recommended fresh poultry, gentle walks, moderated wine, and carefully regulated sleep, that advice assumed resources and control over one's environment that most people simply lacked. Yet even below the elite level, some preventive habits filtered downward in looser forms. Households knew certain foods were considered strengthening, others risky in particular seasons. They knew cold and damp could aggravate pain. They knew overwork weakened the body. They knew foul smells and bad water were suspect. They knew that sudden excess after fasting or scarcity could upset the stomach. The theory might differ by class, but the desire to stay functional was universal. Diet sat at the center of all this. Food was not merely fuel. It was one of the primary ways the body was thought to be shaped and reshaped each day. Bread, pottage, ale, beans, onions, leeks, fish, cheese, eggs, occasional meat, seasonal fruits, and whatever could be gathered or afforded were not just meals. They were health influences. Medieval writers classified foods by qualities: hot, cold, moist, dry, easy to digest, difficult to digest, nourishing, thickening, laxative, windy, corrupting, or restorative. The stomach was not imagined as a simple container. It was a site of transformation, and poor digestion could help explain a remarkable number of bodily troubles. That concern with digestion was not entirely misplaced. In a world of irregular food quality, spoilage, parasites, and heavy labor, the gut truly was central to health. A person who could not digest well could not work well. A person with chronic bowel trouble weakened visibly. So food advice, though framed humoral terms, often emerged from close observation of what different diets did to people. Heavy salted meat might indeed sit badly in summer. Rich banquets could trigger discomfort. Thin, inadequate diets left people frail. Freshness mattered. Season mattered. Quantity mattered. The error was not that medieval people linked food to health. The error, where it existed, lay in the mechanisms they imagined and in the limits imposed by poverty. Poverty, again, is impossible to separate from medicine. Much regimen advice sounds sensible until one remembers that many people ate what was available, not what was ideal. The poor could not easily select a lighter fish over a heavier meat, or choose delicate breads over coarse ones, or avoid damp housing, or rest after meals, or consume expensive spices that were often credited with digestive benefits. They also lived closer to hunger, and hunger distorts every conversation about proper diet. It is one thing to advise moderation at a princely table. It is another to advise a laboring family not to overindulge when they are trying simply to get through winter. Still, even the poor practiced forms of bodily caution. They understood the consequences of rotten food. They worried about water sources. They thinned ale or consumed weak ale in part because water quality could be uncertain. They used fasting rhythms shaped by religion, not only with spiritual significance but with bodily effects. They stored, salted, dried, and smoked foods as best they could, not because they were ignorant of spoilage, but because survival demanded compromise. Medieval health, in this sense, was a ceaseless negotiation with scarcity. People often knew what better conditions looked like. They simply could not sustain them. Air was another powerful category, and here medieval thinking can seem oddly modern at first glance and then suddenly very distant. Good air was associated with health, bad air with corruption and sickness. Stagnant marshes, overcrowded streets, rotting refuse, blocked drains, and foul smells were all feared. This fear rested partly on miasmatic ideas about corrupted air, but also on sensible sensory experience. Places that smelled wrong often were unhealthy in practical ways, even if the mechanism was misunderstood. So households opened windows, closed shutters, burned herbs or pleasant woods, moved beds, or fled certain places when disease seemed to hang over them. Urban authorities sometimes tried to regulate nuisances for similar reasons. But prevention through air quality was always limited by the built environment. A poor family living in a damp, smoky space could not conjure fresh circulating air at will. A crowded town could not become uncrowded because a physician preferred clean breezes. Yet the principle remained strong enough that it shaped responses during outbreaks and ordinary life alike. Rooms were judged by their feel and smell. Sleeping places were chosen, where possible, with bodily comfort in mind. The body was understood as porous to the environment, constantly receiving what the surrounding world impressed upon it. Bathing offers another revealing case. There is a persistent modern myth that medieval people simply did not wash. The truth is more complicated and more interesting. Bathing did exist, sometimes quite regularly depending on time, place, class, and local custom. Public bathhouses operated in many towns for long periods. Washing hands, faces, and feet was common. Linen mattered. Combing and grooming mattered. The medieval world was not clean by modern microbiological standards, but neither was it uniformly indifferent to bodily maintenance. What changed was the infrastructure, the availability of heated water, and later, in some places, anxieties about bathhouses as sites of moral disorder or disease. Bathing also had medical meanings. Warm baths could relax, soften, and open the body. They might be recommended or discouraged depending on season, constitution, and illness. A bath after overeating, after sex, during certain weaknesses, or at the wrong stage of a fever could be considered harmful. Once again, the body was not treated as fixed. It was treated as sensitive, reactive, and vulnerable to timing. Medieval health culture therefore required attention not just to what one did, but when one did it. The same action could strengthen under one set of conditions and weaken under another. Sleep was no less important. To sleep badly was to invite imbalance. Too much sleep could be seen as dulling and moistening the body excessively. Too little sleep dried and heated it, frayed the nerves, weakened digestion, and worsened the emotions. That framework is not entirely alien. Anyone who has lived through exhaustion knows the body begins to malfunction in multiple ways at once. Medieval writers noticed the same. They linked sleep with restoration, digestion, temperament, and clarity of mind. Yet ordinary people often slept under conditions far from restorative. Shared spaces, animals nearby, infants crying, neighbors audible through thin walls, smoke, drafts, parasites, bodily pain, and the demands of dawn labor. This meant that fatigue was not a rare condition but an ordinary background strain. And fatigue, though seldom celebrated in grand historical narratives, may have been one of the most important health realities of the Middle Ages. Tired people heal worse. They think worse. They tolerate hunger and pain worse. They become more vulnerable to emotional strain and physical accident. A society built on manual labor, seasonally compressed work, and uneven nourishment inevitably produced chronic fatigue, and chronic fatigue is itself a kind of medical weather. It changes how every other illness feels. Movement and rest formed another balancing act. Elite regimen encouraged measured exercise, enough to stimulate the body without exhausting it. Sweating was sometimes seen as beneficial in moderation. Sedentary living could be unhealthy. Yet again, such advice fitted elite lives better than peasant ones. Most laborers did not need encouragement to move. They needed the opposite, relief from grinding, repetitive strain. Medieval people knew that overwork could injure and weaken. They may not have framed it in terms of inflammation, stress hormones, or musculoskeletal degeneration, but they saw the effects in bent backs, swollen knees, worn hands, and bodies prematurely aged by toil. That observation raises a subtle but important point. Medieval preventive health was not only about avoiding dramatic disease. It was also about preserving capacity. If the body's balance tipped too far, one might not die, but one might cease to be useful in the full way expected. A mason with shoulder pain, a washerwoman with damaged hands, a plowman with recurring back spasm, a spinner with failing sight all experienced health as the maintenance of function. Medicine in such a world was inseparable from labor. To stay well meant to stay able. Emotions, too, belong to health. This is one part of medieval medicine that modern people sometimes dismiss too quickly. Medical writers warned against excessive anger, prolonged sadness, fear, envy, lust, and grief not merely as moral dangers but as bodily ones. Violent emotions were thought to heat, cool, dry, or disturb the humors. In modern language, the mechanism is different, but the perception that emotion affects the body is hardly absurd. Stress, grief, anxiety, and despair do change appetite, sleep, digestion, immune function, and pain perception. Medieval people noticed this intimately. A bereaved person often did fall ill. A fearful person lost appetite. Rage flushed the face and altered breathing. Shame unsettled the stomach. The body responded to inner life, and medical theory tried to account for that. Religion gave additional shape to this emotional medicine. Confession, prayer, ritual, fasting, feast, pilgrimage, and the liturgical calendar organized not only belief but bodily rhythm. Sometimes this structure may have soothed. Sometimes it imposed burdens. But it did provide a pattern to lives that might otherwise have felt physically and psychologically chaotic. A person struggling with illness, worry, or grief did not face those things inside an empty cultural frame. There were prescribed responses, communal rhythms, saints for specific needs, and narratives of suffering that conferred meaning. This could not remove disease, but it could make it more bearable. Sex and reproduction were also treated as matters of health, not only morality. Medical theory held that sexual activity affected bodily balance, sometimes draining strength, sometimes relieving pressure, depending on circumstance. Too much sex could weaken. Too little, in some discussions, could create other imbalances. Such advice was tangled with moral teaching, but it also reflects a society carefully watching how bodily exertion and desire seem to affect vigor. Reproductive health more broadly remained one of the most difficult areas of medieval life, precisely because prevention there was so uncertain. Pregnancy could not be made safe by regimen alone. Childbirth could not be disciplined out of danger. Here, preventive care often met its sharpest limit. Seasonality governed nearly everything. Winter chilled, constrained diet, and increased crowding indoors. Spring could bring agues and unstable conditions. Summer threatened spoilage and certain fevers. Autumn had its own digestive dangers around harvest abundance and transition. Medieval medicine was profoundly seasonal because medieval life was. Bodies did not exist in climate-controlled neutrality. They were worked on by heat, damp, cold, mud, hunger, harvest rhythms, and shifting daylight. Advice that seems quaint on the page often arose from the fact that the environment changed people constantly. All of this produced a culture of caution that was neither scientific in the modern sense nor merely superstitious. People watched the weather before eating certain foods. They moderated wine when they thought heat was already excessive. They rested after bloodletting or illness. They kept some foods for the weak, some for laborers, some for children. They aired bedding when possible. They valued linen and laundering more than the stereotype of medieval filth suggests. They worried about what entered and left the body. They used herbs not only for cures but for maintenance. Households stocked substances thought useful long before crisis struck. The home, in this sense, was a preventative institution as much as a curative one. A capable household manager, often a woman, was not simply reacting to sickness. She was trying to hold bodily decline at bay through daily management. Bread had to be kept from molding. Milk watched before it turned. Water fetched from the safer source if one was known. The weak fed first in some circumstances. The fire moderated. Infants wrapped neither too lightly nor too heavily. Bedding dried. Waste removed as best it could be. Herbs gathered in season and stored. None of this guaranteed health, but it reveals a quiet intelligence at work in domestic life, one that formal histories of medicine have sometimes undervalued. And then there were amulets, charms, and protective rituals, which complicate the picture further. Modern readers often place these in a separate box marked superstition, but medieval people did not necessarily draw such a clean line. A prayer against fever, a charm worn at the neck, a written verse carried on the body, or a saint's badge near the bed could be part of how one tried to stay safe. These objects offered psychological reassurance, certainly, but they also belonged to a worldview in which language, sanctity, material substances, and divine protection could all interact with the vulnerable body. If the world was charged with spiritual danger and spiritual aid, then prevention naturally included spiritual shielding. The interesting thing is that such practices often coexisted happily with practical ones. A person might clean a wound, avoid foul air, moderate diet, and wear a protective charm without feeling any contradiction. The medieval mind did not require the hard separation between symbolic and practical action that modern secular thought often prefers. Protection could be layered. So could explanation. That layering made medieval medicine more flexible, but also less capable of decisively discarding ineffective beliefs. If something failed, one could always say the practical part had been sound but the spiritual danger too great, or the prayer worthy but the bodily corruption already advanced. Yet for all these efforts at prevention, a great deal remained beyond personal control. A careful household could still be struck by contaminated water. A prudent woman could still die in childbirth. A disciplined monk could still catch a fever from a visiting traveler. A lord following every regimen could still develop stone, gout, or plague. This persistent instability may be one reason medieval medical advice often emphasizes moderation with such almost moral intensity. Moderation was one of the few defenses universally available in theory, even when not in practice. If the world could not be made safe, perhaps at least the self could be governed. There is something poignant in that. Much of medieval health culture was an attempt to cultivate order in a disorderly world. Eat carefully, sleep properly, avoid excess, guard against corruption, keep the body balanced, watch the seasons, control the passions, attend to the signs. These were not foolish rules created by people who never noticed reality. They were the rules of people who noticed reality very closely and were trying to carve predictability out of it. But predictability had limits, and sometimes those limits appeared in the very people who seemed most protected. Wealth, status, literacy, and access to learned care could improve the odds, but they did not abolish vulnerability. Nobles, abbots, merchants, bishops, and queens all got sick. Their chambers were finer, their diets broader, their physicians more learned, but their bodies still bled, inflamed, rotted, and failed. In fact, wealth occasionally introduced its own illnesses. Gout from rich diet, inactivity-related troubles, excess drinking, or the complications of overabundance. The Middle Ages did not distribute pain equally, but they did distribute mortality widely enough to keep everyone uneasy. And that is where the next turn in the story naturally lies. Once we compare the poor sick room to the wealthy chamber, and the village remedy to the physician's learned regimen, the question becomes harder and more revealing. How different was it, really, to be sick without doctors if you were rich enough to have one? Because the answer is not as simple as comfort on one side and misery on the other. In some ways, the wealthy suffered with more ceremony, more attention, and better odds. In other ways, they were trapped inside theories and treatments that could be as uncertain, and sometimes as dangerous, as those used in humbler homes. Those used in humbler homes. The difference begins, certainly, with comfort. A wealthy patient was more likely to fall ill in a private chamber than in a crowded one-room house. The bed was softer, the linens better, the air perhaps less smoky, the food more varied, the attendants more numerous, and the pace of care less constrained by the need for everyone else in the room to keep laboring through the day. That mattered. A body fighting fever or pain benefits from warmth, quiet, clean cloth, consistent fluids, and watchful care. The rich could often supply these things more reliably than the poor. But comfort is not cure, and privilege in the Middle Ages often purchased attention more than certainty. A nobleman with a learned physician at his bedside still lived in a world without antibiotics, safe surgery in the modern sense, imaging, laboratory tests, or a firm understanding of contagion. His urine might be carefully examined in a fine glass flask. His pulse might be taken with impressive seriousness. His diet might be restructured with exquisite detail. He might receive specially prepared syrups, imported spices, electuaries compounded by skilled apothecaries, and consultations based on respected authorities. Yet beneath the elegance of that process remained the same fundamental instability. No one could see into the body clearly enough to know with confidence what was truly wrong. This is one of the more revealing ironies of medieval medicine. The wealthy could surround illness with expertise, but expertise itself was still bound by the limits of the age. A physician could distinguish between constitutions, temperaments, seasons, and likely imbalances. He could quote Galen, Avicenna, Constantine the African, or later medical compilers. He could recommend a sequence of interventions shaped by university learning and courtly precedent. And he might still fail for reasons that were invisible to him. A severe infection, appendicitis, pneumonia, sepsis after childbirth, internal bleeding, a malignant growth, tuberculosis, plague, kidney failure, stroke, or heart disease could all pass through the net of learned interpretation under names or categories that did not lead to effective remedy. Yet it would be unfair to treat learned medicine as empty theater. For wealthy patients, physicians could sometimes offer real advantages. They recognized danger signs. They knew how to organize care. They were trained to think comparatively rather than purely reactively. They had access to written traditions of pharmacology, prognosis, and regimen wider than most households possessed. They might stop a patient from doing something obviously harmful, or insist on rest when pride would otherwise send him back to work or duty too soon. They might prescribe better wound care, prepare compounds with some true benefit, or at least bring order to a sickroom that might otherwise dissolve into anxious contradiction. There was also social power in a physician's presence. A learned practitioner could quiet arguments by imposing an authoritative plan. He could tell relatives when to feed, when not to feed, when to bleed, when to purge, when to keep the room dark, when to change the linens, when to limit visitors, and when to begin spiritual preparation more earnestly. In households crowded with servants, kin, advisors, and political concerns, this mattered a great deal. Illness at the upper levels of society was rarely a private domestic affair. It was also a matter of household governance, inheritance, diplomacy, and prestige. When a lord or lady fell ill, other people's futures hovered around the bed. That pressure could make elite sickness strangely public even inside private space. Courtiers needed news. Relatives wanted access. Servants carried reports from chamber to hall. If the patient was politically important, every sign of improvement or decline could alter alliances, hopes, and fears. A king's fever was not simply a king's fever. It was a possible succession crisis. A queen's difficult childbirth was not only family sorrow, it could become a national matter. A bishop's wasting illness affected benefices and influence. An abbot's decline reshaped monastic administration. For the rich, then, illness often came with an audience and not always a gentle one. That audience could complicate care. Too many visitors exhausted the patient. Too many advisors produced competing remedies. Pious counsel, political anxiety, household habit, and medical opinion all met in the chamber. One man argued for immediate bloodletting. Another thought the body already too weakened. A confessor urged repentance. A relative pressed for a famous physician to be summoned from farther away. A servant had heard of a certain costly spice mixture. An older noblewoman swore by a domestic remedy that had aided someone years before. Elite households were not magically more rational than peasant ones. They simply conducted their uncertainty with richer fabrics and better trained voices. There is, too, a temptation to imagine that the rich always received gentler care. In some ways they did. But in other ways wealth exposed patients to more aggressive intervention precisely because intervention was available. A poor man might lie at home with fever, broth, prayer, and a few local remedies because nothing else could be afforded. A nobleman with the same underlying illness might be bled, purged, clistered, regulated, dosed with expensive compounds, and subjected to repeated changes in regimen because a physician felt compelled to do something commensurate with his status and the seriousness of the case. The richer patient, in other words, could suffer not only from the disease but from the increased medical activity that his wealth made possible. This is one of the most important reversals in the whole subject. We tend to assume that more treatment always means better odds. In the medieval world, that was only partly true. More treatment could mean more informed monitoring and better nursing. It could also mean more blood loss, more purging, more strain on a weakened digestive system, more expensive ingredients of uncertain value, and more manipulation of a body already in crisis. The physician's learning did not exempt him from the era's mistaken assumptions. So the wealthy patient's body might become the site of more elaborate error. Bloodletting makes the point clearly enough. Because physicians had detailed theories about when and how to bleed, elite patients could be bled with great confidence and sophistication. The procedure might be tailored to season, age, temperament, and symptoms. That sounds better than random bleeding, and in one sense it was. It was systematic. But systematic error is still error. If the underlying illness required strength and hydration rather than further depletion, then the patient's status had merely bought him a more refined path toward worsening weakness. The same could be said of purging. Medieval medicine often sought to evacuate corrupt or excessive material through vomiting, laxatives, sweating, or other means. Again, this was not senseless within the framework of humoral imbalance. But for someone already dehydrated, malnourished, or exhausted, aggressive evacuation could be a dangerous gift. A peasant might be too poor to obtain such measures. A prince might receive them beautifully prepared by skilled hands. The outcome could still be grim. And yet, if we lean too hard on this irony, we risk flattening another truth. The rich usually did have better chances overall. They were less exposed to chronic malnutrition, could convalesce longer, had cleaner and warmer spaces available, could travel away from epidemic zones, and could command sustained attendance. A fever in a castle chamber and a fever in a damp peasant hut were not the same event. The body's resources differed. The risk of secondary harms differed. Recovery conditions differed. Even if medicine itself remained uncertain, nursing and environment mattered. Many people throughout history survived not because treatment cured them directly, but because they were supported well enough for the body to survive on its own. Wealth made that survival more likely. This becomes especially visible in chronic illness. A wealthy person with gout, recurring stones, digestive complaints, or lingering weakness might live for years managing the condition with diet changes, travel, spa visits, controlled routines, servants, cushions, fire, and physicians. A poor person with the same underlying burden might simply be worn down by it, because every flare arrived inside a life that could not pause. The nobleman could become an invalid and still be a nobleman. The laborer who became an invalid risked becoming a dependent, a beggar, or a burden beyond what the household could sustain. So while the rich did not escape medical uncertainty, they were buffered against its consequences in ways most people were not. Women of the elite offer another complicated example. A noblewoman had access to better food, attendants, midwives, and possibly physicians or surgeons in difficult births. She might give birth in more controlled surroundings, with better linens, more help, and greater ritual attention. Yet elite childbirth also carried political weight. Pressure to produce heirs, repeated pregnancies, and the close scrutiny of the birthing chamber could make the experience its own form of confinement. If complications arose, there might be more attendance and stronger remedies, but not necessarily more safety. Postpartum infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labor, and the long-term damage of repeated pregnancies remain terrible risks across class lines. The emotional landscape differed too. A poor woman's dangerous labor threatened the immediate survival of the household. A noblewoman's dangerous labor could threaten estates, alliances, dynasties, and succession. The scale widened, but the body still suffered one contraction at a time. That is another recurring pattern in this story. Medieval medicine changes its costume according to status, but underneath, the body remains alarmingly democratic in its vulnerabilities. Children of wealthy households also lived under this paradox. They had nurses, attendants, better food, warmer rooms, and quicker access to clergy and physicians. Yet childhood remained perilous. Rich infants died. Noble children succumbed to fever, flux, coughs, and sudden decline. If anything, the records of elite households sometimes preserve this tragedy more clearly because the lives were documented. We can see the careful efforts made. Relics summoned, physicians consulted, prayers ordered, diets altered, messengers dispatched, royal chapels petitioned. And still the child died, or else survived and became the subject of thanksgiving. Wealth amplified the response. It did not abolish the danger. What the rich perhaps possessed most of all was not freedom from sickness, but the ability to narrate it. Their illnesses entered letters, chronicles, account books, saints' lives, court records, and medical notes. We know more about what was prescribed to them, what foods were ordered, what medicines were purchased, which physicians were called, and what rituals surrounded their decline. This abundance of record can distort our view if we are not careful. It can make elite medicine seem like medieval medicine as a whole. In reality, it was a highly visible upper layer floating over a much broader world of domestic care, local healers, parish ritual, and improvised endurance. Still, those elite records reveal a great deal about how people hoped medicine should work. They show a longing for order, for consultation, for the best authorities, for careful sequence, for rational diagnosis, for regimens that could be followed with almost moral seriousness. They also show how often even the best resourced care ended in phrases that feel painfully familiar across the centuries. The patient worsened, the fever continued, the swelling did not diminish, all remedies were tried, prayers were offered, and at last there was nothing more to do. There is something quietly humbling in that. The distance between rich and poor was enormous in medieval society, but the distance between both and actual mastery over the body was still larger than either might have wished. A wealthy lord could command men, horses, lands, rents, and halls, yet not command an infected tooth not to spread, or a fever not to return, or a stone not to cause agony, or a wound not to fester. That tension between political power and biological helplessness is one reason illness so often unsettled medieval writers. Sickness reminded everyone that lordship ended at the skin. Some tried to push back against that truth through accumulation. More physicians, more consultations, better apothecaries, imported substances from farther away. Musk, sugar, spices, costly theriacs, pearls ground into preparations, exotic resins, and compounds whose expense itself implied potency. But costly medicine could easily function as theater as well as therapy. Price reassured, rarity impressed, complexity suggested intelligence. In some cases, the ingredients may have had minor benefits. In others, prestige likely did much of the work. To hold an elaborate imported preparation at the bedside of a prince was to signal that nothing had been spared. It soothed the household's conscience, if not the disease. This interplay between treatment and status shaped apothecaries too. In larger towns, apothecaries could prepare and sell compounds, syrups, powders, ointments, and spices used medicinally or dietetically. They were part merchant, part technician, part custodian of material possibility. Their shelves represented a kind of medical promise. Yet that promise remained stratified by cost. Rich patients could access elaborate preparations. Poor patients relied more on local herbs, kitchen materials, and simpler compounds. Here medicine was also commerce. The body's weakness opened a market, and the market obeyed hierarchy. But status could not fully purchase good judgment. Physicians disagreed with one another. Schools differed. Authors were interpreted differently. Bedside circumstances altered what theory suggested. A doctor trained in one intellectual milieu might prescribe differently from another. And even a good physician faced the maddening reality that similar symptoms could lead to different outcomes. Two patients presented with fever and weakness. One recovered after moderate bleeding and careful diet. Another, treated similarly, declined. Without modern methods of controlled comparison, such variations did not clarify medicine so much as entrench argument. Learned medicine, like domestic medicine, lived among uncertainties that experience could not always settle cleanly. That is why prognosis was so important. Physicians were valued not only for cure but for their ability to read the likely course of illness. To say whether a fever was dangerous, whether a crisis day approached, whether recovery was possible, whether the patient should prepare spiritually, whether travel was safe, whether the birth might end badly, whether the swelling looked mortal. Even when cure failed, accurate prognosis carried social and moral value. It allowed households to plan, confessors to act, inheritances to be considered, and people to brace themselves. In some ways, then, the best medieval doctor may have been less a conqueror of disease than a disciplined interpreter of it. For the sick, that interpretation mattered psychologically. Uncertainty is harder to bear when no one even appears to understand the pattern. A calm physician naming the danger, even in imprecise terms, could steady the room. He might be wrong about cause but right about gravity. He might not cure the patient, but he could tell the family that the illness was indeed serious, that the next days would matter, that the patient should be kept quiet, warmed, nourished lightly, and perhaps prepared for confession. This is not nothing. It is a kind of medicine rooted in structure rather than solution. If we keep that in mind, the contrast between having doctors and not having them becomes more subtle. For most ordinary medieval people, the absence of a learned physician meant relying on household wisdom, local reputation, prayer, and improvisation. For the wealthy, having a physician meant gaining more order, more attention, and sometimes somewhat better odds, but not crossing into modern security. The real divide was not between superstition and science, or ignorance and expertise, but between different levels of organized uncertainty. And that organized uncertainty became even more visible in the places where learned medicine met institutions. Universities, courts, monasteries, and urban centers where medical ideas circulated in writing. Their sickness without doctors gradually turned into sickness with medical culture but still without decisive power. That distinction matters because it reveals how the medieval world could feel intellectually sophisticated and physically helpless at the same time. The next stage of this story lies in that tension. How texts, training, translation, and reputation built a medical world that sounded increasingly impressive, even while ordinary bodies continued to suffer in ways no theory could fully master and no theory could fully master. And that is where medieval medicine becomes especially interesting, because once we move into universities, scriptoria, courts, and monasteries, the story stops looking like simple absence and starts looking like ambition. The medieval world did not merely endure sickness. It tried, in serious and increasingly organized ways, to think about sickness, classify it, teach about it, write it down, preserve old authorities, reconcile conflicting traditions, and build a learned language around the unstable body. If most people still lived and died far from a physician's chamber, the intellectual world of medicine was nonetheless growing around them, and that created one of the central tensions of the age. Knowledge was expanding faster than reliable power over disease. A great deal of that growth came through transmission. Medieval Western Europe did not invent its medical culture from nothing. It inherited fragments of ancient Greek and Roman learning, received them through Latin traditions, and then absorbed a vast enrichment through the Arabic-speaking world, where scholars had translated, commented upon, criticized, and expanded earlier medicine with remarkable seriousness. By the High Middle Ages, texts associated with Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, Rhazes, and many others circulated in ways that reshaped what educated medicine looked like. This mattered because it gave medieval physicians something more than local custom. It gave them a library, A library can be a powerful thing, especially in a world where direct experimentation is limited and case records remain uneven. Creates continuity. It lets one practitioner in Italy, France, England, or Iberia think with the help of minds long dead and far away. It offers terminology, categories, prognostic signs, regimen plans, pharmacological lists, and ways of arguing. But a library can also become a kind of elegant prison. If the foundational texts are authoritative enough, they can shape perception so strongly that the body is continually forced back into inherited systems, even when experience is messy or contradictory. This was not unique to the Middle Ages, of course. Every learned tradition risks mistaking its map for the terrain. What makes the medieval case so compelling is that the stakes were so immediate. A physician reading Galen was not just entering an academic debate. He was deciding whether a patient should be bled, purged, fed, or rested. He was deciding how to interpret fever, melancholy, obstruction, or putrefaction. Texts became actions, and actions fell upon bodies that might or might not survive them. Universities helped formalize this process. As institutions in places such as Bologna, Montpellier, Paris, Padua, and elsewhere took shape, medicine became one of the learned faculties through which educated men could be trained. That training did not look like modern clinical education. It was deeply textual. Students read authorities, listened to lectures, learned to reconcile contradictions, absorbed logical methods, and studied medical theory as part of a broader intellectual culture. In some contexts, they also encountered anatomy, but not with the routine depth of later medicine. The educated physician was therefore often, first and foremost, a reader and interpreter. That may sound abstract, but in the medieval world abstraction conferred prestige. To belong to the learned professions was to stand inside a world of Latin literacy, argument, and institutional validation. Physicians shared certain features with theologians and lawyers. They operated through texts and reasoned judgment. They possessed technical vocabularies inaccessible to most ordinary people. They belonged to a social category whose authority rested partly in specialized speech. That alone could alter the sickroom. A learned doctor did not only bring remedies. He brought a style of thought that marked him as part of a higher interpretive order. Yet that very distance could create friction. The household knew the patient intimately. It knew what he had eaten, how she usually slept, which pains were old and which new, what the body smelled like on better days, whether the cough sounded wrong, whether this fever resembled last year's or not. The physician, by contrast, brought general principles and external categories. Ideally, the two forms of knowledge would meet fruitfully. In reality, they could pull against one another. A doctor might prescribe according to theory what the household found impractical, expensive, or plainly unhelpful based on experience. The household might cling to a remedy the doctor dismissed. Neither side stood entirely outside reason. They simply reasoned from different kinds of authority. This is one reason medieval medicine remained plural even as learned culture expanded. University training did not wipe away local healers, midwives, barber surgeons, monastic infirmarians, or domestic remedy traditions. It layered itself over them. Sometimes these layers cooperated. Sometimes they competed. A wound might be treated surgically by one person, nourished with household broths by another, prayed over by a priest, and evaluated humoral terms by a physician. The patient's body became the meeting place of multiple medical worlds. Monasteries played a significant role in this meeting. Religious houses preserved texts, cultivated medicinal gardens, cared for the sick among their own members and sometimes among the poor, and embodied a form of organized caregiving that linked bodily attention to spiritual discipline. A monastic infirmary was not a hospital in the modern sense, but it was a place where observation, routine, prayer, diet, and some knowledge of remedies could be brought together within institutional stability. Monks and nuns were not all physicians, but monastic communities often knew a great deal about keeping weakened bodies alive as long as possible. That knowledge was practical and repetitive. The infirmarian who had watched older monks decline, tended brothers through seasonal fevers, managed digestive complaints during fasting regimes, prepared herbs, and oversaw recovery from minor injuries had a kind of experience no text alone could supply. And yet monastic medicine, like household medicine, was filtered through theology and institutional purpose. A monk's body belonged partly to the rule. Care was offered, but discipline remained. Food might be adjusted, duties reduced, beds provided, but all within a world that also valued obedience, restraint, and spiritual vigilance. Illness did not suspend the moral life. It intensified it. At court, the dynamic looked different. Court physicians worked near power, luxury, and political anxiety. Their patients were not anonymous bodies but strategic ones. To treat a ruler or great noble was to practice medicine under observation and risk. If the patient recovered, the physician's reputation rose. If the patient died, the physician could become a convenient focus for suspicion, resentment, or retrospective blame. Court medicine was therefore often highly ceremonial. Consultations multiplied. Opinions were weighed. Messages were sent for famous doctors from distant cities. Prescriptions could be copied, discussed, and adapted with remarkable seriousness. And here one sees another subtle twist. The more socially important the patient, the harder it could become to practice simple care. A powerful man's chamber drew more advisors, more interruptions, more concern, and more pressure to act decisively. Rest, quiet, and bodily ease might be exactly what the patient needed, but rest, quiet, and bodily ease are difficult to preserve when a household, a court, or a kingdom is waiting just beyond the curtain for news. Status brought resources but also disturbance. The body became the center of a small political storm. Medical texts themselves often reveal this mixture of intellectual rigor and bodily fragility. They discuss urine, pulse, critical days, fevers, complexion, diet, evacuation, and prognosis with real seriousness. They attempt classification. They compare authorities. They attend to nuance. And yet there is often, beneath the confidence of the system, an almost haunting awareness that the body can still refuse to fit. A patient may exhibit mixed signs. A fever may shift character. A treatment may work in theory yet fail in practice. A constitution may be difficult to judge. The language of medicine strives for order because the material it confronts is always threatening to dissolve that order. Pulse-taking is a useful example. Medieval learned medicine inherited and elaborated ideas about the pulse as an indicator of inner condition. The physician's trained fingers sought rhythm, strength, speed, fullness, and deviation. This was a genuine attempt to read the hidden body through accessible signs. Modern clinicians still take pulses, though now with very different surrounding knowledge. The medieval physician was not foolish to think the pulse mattered. The difficulty lay in how much interpretive weight had to be carried by so few observable clues. The pulse could tell you something was wrong, could not reveal bacteria, organ failure, embolism, arrhythmia in modern categories, or microscopic pathology. It was a doorway, not a full map. The same was true of anatomy. Medieval medicine is often accused of knowing almost nothing about the body's structure, but that is too crude. There was anatomical knowledge drawn from ancient texts, animal dissection, surgical experience, and, in some places and periods, limited human dissection. Surgeons in particular knew a good deal about visible and tangible structures. But anatomy as an academic field did not yet function as the central engine of medicine in the way it later would. The living body was still interpreted more through qualities, fluids, functions, and balances than through lesion-based internal localization. That meant one could be anatomically curious and still therapeutically constrained. Indeed, one of the most profound limits on medieval medicine was not lack of intelligence but lack of leverage. Even if a physician recognized that an internal organ was likely involved, what then? He could not image it, culture it, cut safely into it in most cases, replace its function, or pharmacologically target its failure. There is a temptation, when looking backward, to ask why past people did not know what we know. A better question is what difference that knowledge could have made even if partially acquired. Without anesthesia, antisepsis, antibiotics, transfusion, and laboratory medicine, many truths about the body remained hard to act upon. This helps explain why regimen retained such prestige. When cure is uncertain, regulation becomes medicine's most reliable form. One adjusts diet, sleep, environment, evacuation, sexual activity, and emotion because these are the levers one can actually reach. The physician may not be able to remove a hidden cause, but he can order the patient's way of living. In that sense, medieval medicine was often strongest not when it promised miracles but when it managed convalescence, weakness, chronic conditions, and the ordinary drift of health toward imbalance. Its successes were likely modest and unspectacular, and for that very reason they are harder for history to see. Pharmacology likewise deserves a more careful look than either romantic praise or easy mockery allows. Medieval materia medica was extensive. It included plants, minerals, animal products, resins, spices, sugars, oils, vinegars, and complex compounded preparations. Apothecaries and medical texts cataloged them with impressive diligence. Some ingredients had real physiological effects. Others were inert, symbolic, or valuable largely because tradition said they should be. Still others might be helpful in one form and harmful in another. The challenge was not only identifying useful substances. It was standardization, purity, dose, preservation, and selection. A remedy might work sometimes and fail utterly at other times because the plant was poor, the preparation degraded, the patient's condition different, or the underlying disease beyond its reach. Complex compounds such as theriac are particularly revealing. Famous for centuries, theriac combined many ingredients and was praised as an antidote, a restorative, and a defense against various poisons and illnesses. To modern eyes, it looks almost impossibly broad in its claims. Yet its longevity tells us something about the psychology of pre-modern medicine. In a world of uncertain causes, people valued remedies that promised general strengthening or broad protection. A medicine that might support the body against many threats was deeply attractive. Whether or not it fulfilled those promises consistently is another matter. The social life of medicine also mattered. Texts moved, recipes traveled, practitioners borrowed, towns developed reputations, certain medical schools became famous, certain physicians attracted noble patronage, certain saints' shrines gained healing prestige. Medical culture, in other words, was not static. It was networked. Knowledge spread through manuscripts, letters, teaching, trade, and rumor. This circulation gave medieval people more resources than the phrase "without doctors" might suggest. But again, resources are not the same as mastery. A world can be rich in theory and still poor in outcomes. There was also the persistent divide between internal medicine and manual intervention. Learned physicians often held higher status than surgeons, who dealt more directly with the physical body through cutting, stitching, setting bones, draining abscesses, and treating wounds. The old contrast between handwork and learned interpretation was social as well as medical. Surgery could save lives, especially in trauma, but it lacked some of the prestige of university learning. Barber surgeons, bone setters, and practical operators inhabited an ambiguous status. They were indispensable in certain crises and yet often ranked below the Latin reading physician. This ambiguity mattered for patients. If your problem was a shattered limb, a sword wound, a boil, a cataract, a stone, or a tooth, the handworker might matter more than the scholar. If your problem was fever, wasting, melancholy, or digestive trouble, the scholar's language of balance might dominate. But bodies do not divide themselves neatly according to professional boundaries. One patient might need both. A wound becomes a fever. A childbirth becomes a surgical emergency. A stone causes systemic weakness. The fragmentation of medical roles therefore created gaps, overlaps, and sometimes dangerous delays. Women's medical knowledge remained especially important despite the male dominance of universities. Midwives, experienced matrons, and female healers possessed forms of bodily familiarity that elite written medicine could not easily replace. They knew the rhythms of labor, infant care, breast problems, menstrual irregularities, and household treatment in ways grounded in repeated intimate experience. Yet because so much of learned culture was male and textual, women's contributions were often less formally recorded and more easily dismissed by later historians. This creates a distortion. The medieval medical world was not only what survives in Latin manuscripts. It was also what circulated in kitchens, birthing rooms, gardens, and whispered advice between women. Sometimes these worlds intersected directly. Learned texts absorbed popular remedies. Household practices borrowed prestigious ingredients or phrases from elite medicine. Monastic recipe books blended devotional and practical knowledge. The result was not a tidy hierarchy from superstition at the bottom to science at the top. It was a layered ecology of care, in which ideas moved across class and institutional lines while retaining different meanings in each setting. The patient, meanwhile, remained caught in the middle of all this intellectual richness and practical limitation. Imagine being sick enough to frighten your household, wealthy enough to summon a physician, devout enough to want sacramental preparation, and uncomfortable enough to crave only cool water and silence. Around you stand texts made flesh and human form. The learned doctor interpreting your urine, the apothecary sending compounds, the priest murmuring prayers, the surgeon waiting if the swelling worsens, the household manager supervising food and bedding, the old aunt insisting the patient always hated that remedy even as a child. This is not medical emptiness. It is medical density. But density is not the same as cure. Perhaps that is why medieval medical writing so often returns to prognosis and moderation. Beneath the grand authorities and formal theories lies a recurring admission, though rarely phrased as such: the body exceeds us. It exceeds the household, the herb garden, the monastic infirmary, the university lecture, the princely apothecary, and the physician's reasoning hand upon the pulse. One can observe, classify, soothe, drain, cool, heat, purge, nourish, and pray. One can be clever. One can be learned. And still the fever may continue. That reality shaped not only how people were treated, but how they imagined the limits of human effort itself. Medicine was honorable, necessary, and worth pursuing. But it was never sovereign. God, chance, constitution, season, sin, fortune, and bodily hiddenness all complicated its reach. In practice, that meant the sick often moved between confidence and humility, intervention and resignation, with very little contradiction felt between those states. A physician could be summoned urgently and still be understood as only one participant in a larger drama no mortal entirely controlled. And then, at intervals, an event would arrive that exposed those limits so completely that all the layers of medieval medicine, household wisdom, monastic care, learned theory, courtly regimen, local charity, spiritual preparation, were forced into the same overwhelming test. That is where the subject changes scale. Individual sickness becomes collective terror. Ordinary uncertainty becomes mass helplessness. And the entire question of what it meant to be ill without dependable doctors moves into its most severe form, because sooner or later, the medieval world encountered not just one fever in one bed, but the kind of sickness that filled streets, emptied houses, overran care, and made even the best medical minds sound suddenly, frighteningly small, frighteningly small. And perhaps that is the most honest place to bring this journey to rest, because once illness became collective in the medieval world, all the ordinary arrangements we have been tracing, the household remedies, the local healer, the careful regimen, the prayer at the bedside, the physician's measured authority, the charity of hospitals, the discipline of monasteries, the comforts of wealth, the endurance of the poor, were tested at once, and often found painfully unequal to the scale of suffering. But even there, the deepest truth of this history does not lie only in failure. It lies in what people did while failing to control what hurt them. They watched over one another. They learned from memory because memory was one of the few tools available. They passed down herbs, cautions, prayers, diet rules, and observations about heat, swelling, smell, appetite, and weakness. They built charitable institutions not because those institutions could cure everything, but because abandonment was worse. They called priests because the soul needed structure when the body no longer offered reassurance. They summoned physicians because learning, even limited learning, was better than none. They trusted midwives, neighbors, widows, surgeons, monks, and household managers because lived experience mattered. And above all, they kept trying to make sense of pain in a world where pain arrived constantly and explanation was never complete. That is what makes the subject more moving, and perhaps more uncomfortable, than it first appears. It would be easy to look back and see only ignorance. Easy to imagine medieval people as helpless in a way that flatters the modern viewer. But that is not quite right. They were not helpless all the time. They were attentive, inventive, observant, disciplined, devotional, and often surprisingly practical. What they lacked was not effort, nor seriousness, nor compassion. What they lacked were the later breakthroughs that turned observation into intervention with far greater precision. And once you see that clearly, the Middle Ages begin to feel less like a foreign country of absurd remedies and more like a familiar human world placed under harsher conditions. A fever still frightened them because fever is frightening. A child's sudden weakness still shattered a household because it always does. A long night beside a sickbed still stretched time into something strange and heavy. A recovering patient asking quietly for water still brought relief. A room preparing for death still fell into the same hush that human beings have probably always known. In that sense, what it was like to be sick without doctors in the Middle Ages was not simply to be medically deprived. It was to live in a society where illness remained woven into ordinary life, where the boundary between home and hospital was thin, where care was mostly communal, where comfort often mattered more than cure, where the rich could purchase better chances but not certainty, and where the body's decline forced every household, sooner or later, into questions larger than medicine alone. It also meant that health itself was valued differently. Not as a default state quietly protected by systems humming in the background, but as something visibly fragile, always needing to be maintained through food, rest, air, labor, prayer, luck, and restraint. Modern life often allows people to forget how easily a small bodily change can become serious. Medieval life did not offer that forgetfulness. The body remained close, demanding, and difficult. Its weakness was never far from view. Perhaps that is why medieval people could sound at once resigned and intensely active. They accepted limits without ceasing to respond. They knew many illnesses could not be mastered, yet they still mixed the broth, changed the cloth, inspected the wound, fetched the priest, sent for the healer, adjusted the bedding, opened the shutter, closed the shutter, lit the candle, held the hand, and waited through the dark. History sometimes gives too much dignity to victories and not enough to endurance. But endurance was one of the great medieval arts. And maybe that is the lingering irony at the heart of this whole story. The world we have explored sounds medically poorer than our own, and in the most obvious ways it certainly was. Yet it may also have been more honest about some things that modern systems can hide behind machines, paperwork, and professional distance. That sickness is frightening, that care is exhausting, that uncertainty weighs on everyone in the room, and that even when medicine grows more powerful, the experience of being vulnerable in a failing body never becomes entirely technical. So when we picture the medieval sick now, it may be worth imagining them a little more quietly and a little more accurately. Not as caricatures swallowing nonsense in a filthy void, but as people in dark rooms, village cottages, monastic infirmaries, crowded town houses, noble chambers, and charitable hospitals, doing what human beings have always done when someone they love begins to burn with fever or fade with weakness. They tried to help with what they had. Sometimes it was enough. Often it was not. And life continued around that fact, shaped by it in ways both practical and profound. If there is a final lesson in all this, it may be that the history of medicine is not only the history of discovery. It is also the history of waiting, watching, improvising, and caring before discovery arrived. The Middle Ages remind us that for most of human history, sickness was managed not by systems of assured rescue, but by webs of imperfect knowledge and stubborn presence. That does not make the past noble. It makes it human, and perhaps that is the detail I would leave you with tonight. Not the leech, not the flask of urine, not the dramatic bloodletting, though all of those belong to the story, but the quieter image of a household listening for a sick person's breathing before dawn, hoping for one more hour, one more sign of turning, one more reason to believe the body might yet return. Across all the centuries, that may be the part that feels least distant. If you'd like, tell me in the comments which details surprised you most, or what part of medieval illness felt hardest to imagine living through. And if you enjoy these calm journeys into the stranger corners of the past, subscribing is a gentle way to find your way back for the next one.